March 1941. Mare Island Naval Shipyard glows beneath the night sky. Inside, a welder's torch flickers like a heartbeat. Ted Nelson wipes sweat from his brow and whispers, "There has to be a better way." He doesn't know it yet, but that thought will soon change the war. The shipyard never sleeps. Thousands of men work beneath giant steel frames. Hammers echo through the fog, each strike stealing another second from a war that hasn't yet begun. Nelson looks around and sees only waste, time slipping away like smoke. Everyone tells him to weld faster, follow orders, ignore ideas. But deep inside, something burns hotter than the torch. If you believe one person can still change history, leave a like and stay. This story begins with a spark and ends with a legacy. Late that night, Ted opens his worn notebook. He sketches a strange shape, a welding gun no one asked for. Outside, fog covers the river, as if hiding the future itself. Soon, the sparks of one man's idea will set the shipyards ablaze. March 1941. Inside Mare Island Naval Shipyard, the air vibrated with the sound of hammers and the hiss of welding arcs. Men climbed endless ladders of scaffolding, tightening bolts beneath submarine decks. Each connection took minutes. Each deck took days. Wooden planks above, cold steel below, a maze of sweat, sparks, and noise. Ted Nelson worked in the half-light, his back aching, his patience thinning. He could feel the pressure, the whole world waiting for ships that were not yet built. He looked at the scaffolding around him, a forest of wasted effort, and whispered under his breath, "This is madness." Everywhere he looked, the problem was the same. Dozens of men spent hours on a single section of deck, drilling, tightening, hammering. 2 full days just to build the scaffolding, 1 more to tear it down. Nelson wasn't angry at the men. He was angry at the process. The Navy demanded speed, yet forced them to use ancient methods. He knew war was coming. He could feel it in the air, in the rush orders, in the way supervisors shouted. America was not ready, and time was running out. The decks above creaked under heavy boots. Each plank had to be drilled, bolted, and sealed by hand. Thousands of holes for every ship. From below, Nelson watched the bolts descend through the steel frames, each one demanding a man, a wrench, a turn, and another hour. His gloves were torn, his knuckles raw. He thought not of his pain, but of the wasted motion, of what could be if someone dared to change it. He had seen men fall from scaffolds. He had seen weeks lost to weather and rework. The Navy called it precision. He called it madness. The workers joked to survive, but every joke hid exhaustion. Sometimes, when the torches went quiet at night, he would walk the empty decks, listening to the silence that followed the noise. It sounded almost holy, like a moment before revelation. Somewhere inside that silence, an idea began to take shape. Outside the shipyard, clouds gathered over the Pacific. Rumors of war traveled through the cafeteria like sparks through dry wood. Inside, the battle was already being fought, not with weapons, but with inefficiency. Nelson welded quietly, but his mind refused to rest. Every slow turn of a bolt felt like defeat. Every wasted hour was another submarine that might never sail. He felt trapped between loyalty to his duty and the knowledge that there had to be a better way. The supervisors wanted obedience, not ideas. But Ted wasn't built that way. He had spent 15 years in machine shops across California, learning, observing, imagining. He knew steel like others knew people. And as he watched the glow of his torch reflect on the submarine hull, he realized something profound. If the Navy wouldn't change, maybe someone else had to. Maybe one man could start his own quiet revolution, one spark at a time. Night settled over Mare Island like a heavy blanket. The machines rested, but the silence was louder than the noise. Nelson sat on an overturned crate, hands still trembling from hours of welding. Around him, the shipyard loomed like a sleeping giant. Cranes frozen, torches dim, the smell of burned steel in the air. He thought about the scaffolding, the wasted movement, the endless hours, every plank secured by pain and repetition, every bolt a reminder that time was slipping away. He could still hear the echoes of the day, boots on steel, shouted orders, the hiss of heat meeting metal. He wondered if anyone else saw what he saw, that this was not progress, but delay disguised as order. In that stillness, his mind began to wander, searching for a way to make the impossible easier. The answer wasn't clear yet, but the silence had planted a seed. Morning came cold and gray, but Ted Nelson felt something burning inside him. He walked past the rows of scaffolds, past the torches and bolts, and stopped to watch sunlight touch the submarine hull. It shimmered like a mirror, showing him both the problem and the solution he had yet to find. He took out his small notebook, the one he used for lunch breaks and quiet thoughts, and began to draw. The lines came quickly. A sketch of a gun, a strange cap, a dream still without a name. It was fragile, half-formed, and easy to dismiss, like a whisper drowned by the noise of hammers. But he kept drawing. He didn't know it yet, but those pencil strokes would change everything. From this moment forward, the war against inefficiency would no longer be fought in silence. It would be fought with sparks, and that spark was about to ignite. The notebook was small, the kind used by mechanics to jot down part numbers. But to Ted Nelson, it became a map. Each page filled with half-formed thoughts, fragments of sketches, strange shapes that only he could understand. By candlelight, he imagined a new way to connect steel, a way that would end the scaffolding forever. He could see it in his mind, a gun that could weld from one side only. Fast, clean, simple. He whispered as he drew, "No scaffolding, no bolts, no wasted men." The lines took form like blueprints for a miracle. His wife, Emma, often found him there long after midnight. The light from his lamp made shadows dance across the walls. She didn't interrupt. She only watched him, knowing that whatever he was chasing was bigger than sleep. Ted's hands were steady, but his heart raced. For the first time, his anger had turned into purpose. He was no longer fighting his supervisors. He was fighting time itself. Each evening, after his shift, Ted returned to his small garage. The floor was cold concrete, the air thick with the smell of oil and iron. Old parts from the shipyard lay scattered across the bench, bolts, cables, wires, and a rusted power source. From these scraps, he began to shape his idea. A spring inside the handle, a trigger, a small ceramic cap to hold the flux. If it worked, it could weld a stud in a single second, strong, permanent, and without scaffolding. He imagined thousands of men freed from dark compartments below decks, thousands of hours saved. But imagination was only the beginning. He tested, failed, and tested again. The flux caps melted too early, the spring jammed, the welds cracked. Emma watched from the doorway, arms folded but eyes soft. When he grew frustrated, she said quietly, "You're closer every night, Ted." And somehow that was enough. He turned back to the torch, sparks flying into the darkness like tiny promises of victory. Weeks passed. The notebook became a manual. The dream became a machine. One evening, Ted clamped a stud to a steel plate, loaded his handmade gun, and whispered a prayer. He pressed the trigger. For one breathless moment. Silence. Then, light. The arc flared bright enough to blind the night. When the smoke cleared, the stud held firm. No bolts, no scaffolding, no wasted men. It worked. He stared at the glowing metal, unable to speak. After months of rejection and frustration, the sound of that single spark was more powerful than applause. He tested again and again, vertical, overhead, angled, each weld perfect. It was the sound of revolution, one that began not with generals or orders, but with a single welder in a small garage. And though no one else heard it yet, history had just changed direction. By May 1941, his garage glowed like a forge of dreams. The walls were scorched with light, the air filled with the hum of power. Ted adjusted his new version of the welding gun. Smoother, faster, refined. He had replaced the spring, reshaped the ceramic cap, and balanced the pressure. This was the version he would show the world. He tested it again and again until every movement was muscle memory. One stud, one spark, one perfect weld. Each flash of light reminded him of what was possible when no one believed in you. Outside, the dawn crept through the mist over Vallejo. He stood by the open door, exhausted but alive. His hands were black with soot, his face glowing with quiet triumph. For the first time, he wasn't dreaming. He was ready. He knew the Navy would resist. He knew men in suits would laugh. But he also knew that they could not stop what already worked. The fire had left the torch and entered his heart. A week later, Ted carried his invention into the shipyard. His fellow welders gathered around, curious, hopeful. The gun looked strange, part tool, part mystery. He demonstrated the weld, a quick flash, a perfect joint. Gasps filled the air. "You need to show Morrison," someone said. Ted nodded. He already had that plan. But the door he was about to knock on would not open easily. The Navy didn't trust garage miracles, especially not from welders. As he walked toward the supervisor's office, the torchlight behind him faded. What awaited him wasn't recognition, but rejection. Yet that rejection would become the spark that proved him right. Sometimes, the road to history begins with a closed door, and the courage to knock anyway. The next chapter of his life, and of America's shipbuilding miracle, was about to begin. The air inside the supervisor's office was heavy with smoke and rules. Ted stood before Lieutenant Morrison, his notebook open, his hands trembling but sure. He explained everything: the ceramic cap, the spring, the single-second weld. He spoke with quiet precision, not as a dreamer, but as a man who had already done it. Morrison glanced at the sketches, unimpressed. "We have procedures, Nelson. Navy specifications. We don't experiment here." Ted tried again, but the words fell like sparks into water. The lieutenant closed the notebook and said, "Stick to your shift." The walk back to the floor felt endless. His torch hissed to life again, but the sound no longer meant progress. It meant denial. Around him, the men worked as before, unaware that a revolution had just been rejected. Ted kept his head down, but his mind burned. He had proven it could work, yet the Navy refused to see it. In that moment, he realized, sometimes the hardest battles are not fought in war, but in offices. Ted didn't give up easily. He rewrote his proposal carefully, adding every measurement, every calculation, every benefit. He addressed it to the shipyard commander, Captain Thomas Withers, and sent it through proper channels. He waited. 3 weeks later, a reply arrived, a polite form letter. "Your idea has been forwarded to the Bureau of Ships for evaluation. Expected review time, 18 to 24 months. By then, Ted thought, the war might already be over. He read the letter again and again. Not because he hoped for something new, but because he couldn't believe how easily they dismissed him. His invention could save thousands of hours, maybe lives. And yet it was trapped behind bureaucracy. He crumpled the paper in his hand and dropped it into the waste bin. That night, as he packed up his tools, he whispered to himself, "If they won't listen, I'll make them listen." It was no longer just an idea, it was a mission. The following day, Ted returned to work as if nothing had happened. The same noise, the same orders, the same indifference. But inside, something had changed. He no longer saw bolts and beams. He saw proof of blindness. Every wasted hour mocked the men who had told him to obey. He wasn't angry anymore, only resolute. He could no longer unsee the better way. It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. He watched his fellow welders bent under steel decks, wrenching bolts through the night. He thought of how many lives could be freed from this exhaustion. A man across the floor looked up and nodded, sensing the storm inside him. Ted nodded back. Sometimes the quietest man in the room is the one already planning his next move. And Nelson's next move would no longer involve permission. It would involve courage. The shipyard echoed with the same rhythm, metal on metal. Orders shouted over noise, but Ted no longer heard any of it. Every sound became part of the same answer he already knew. Nothing would change unless he made it change. That night, he stayed long after everyone had gone home. He looked up at the submarine hull above him, its steel skin glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a question. How much longer would men break their backs doing things the old way, when the new way already existed? He could almost hear his invention calling to him from the garage, waiting to be born again, for real. He packed his tools quietly. Outside, the fog rolled in from the bay, swallowing the floodlights one by one. The world beyond the gates looked vast, uncertain, but free. Ted understood what he had to do. If the Navy refused to believe in his idea, he would believe enough for both of them. He wasn't just leaving a job, he was stepping out of the machine to build a better one. The next morning, Ted placed his resignation on the supervisor's desk. Morrison barely looked up. "Don't throw away a steady job for some crazy idea," he said flatly. Ted smiled faintly. "I'm not throwing it away," he replied. "I'm building something new." With $11 in his pocket and a garage full of dreams, he walked out of Mare Island for the last time. Behind him, the sounds of hammers and torches faded into silence. Ahead of him, only possibility. He didn't know if it would work. He didn't know if anyone would ever listen. But for the first time in his life, he felt weightless, free of the system that refused to see. Sometimes progress begins with one person daring to walk away. If you believe that even a single idea can change history, leave a like and stay with us. Because in the next chapter, this welder's garage will turn into something far greater. A revolution built not from orders, but from sparks. The garage behind Ted's small house in Vallejo was little more than a shed. But to him, it felt like a laboratory of hope. Scrap steel lay in piles beside old machine parts. A single hanging bulb buzzed softly above his workbench. Here, there were no officers, no orders, no rules, only imagination. Emma stood in the doorway, arms folded, her eyes soft with worry. "You're supposed to build Navy parts, not your own," she whispered. Ted smiled faintly without looking up. "This will help the Navy," he said. "They just don't know it yet." Nights passed without sleep. The sound of grinding metal echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Ted worked with the precision of a man racing against time itself. The smell of oil and ozone filled the air. On the bench before him, a new kind of welding gun began to take shape. Not perfect, not polished, but alive. Each part fit like a promise. Each spark lit a future he could almost touch. The revolution had begun, in a garage barely large enough to hold it. Weeks of trial and failure shaped the invention. Ted built, broke, and rebuilt, each mistake teaching him what perfection required. He scavenged parts from discarded shipyard equipment, using whatever he could find: springs, wires, handles. By late May, his hands moved like clockwork. The gun was ready, crude, heavy, but functional. He loaded a stud, pressed it against the steel plate, and pulled the trigger. The light flared, the metal fused, and for the first time the weld held perfectly in place. He had done it. Emma stepped closer, eyes wide. Her husband stood in the pale blue glow of the arc, a look of quiet disbelief on his face. The gun hissed softly as the weld cooled. Ted touched the metal, feeling its strength. It was more than steel, it was proof. Proof that courage could outlast rejection. That one man's idea, built in a garage, could rival the machinery of the world's largest navy. He smiled and whispered to himself, "It works." The next day, Ted brought his gun to the shipyard during lunch break. He didn't make a speech. He simply placed a steel plate on a crate and showed his friends what it could do. A flash, a hiss, and the stud was fused perfectly. No scaffolding, no bolts, no wasted time. The men stood silent for a moment. Then the murmurs began. "This could change everything. You need to show Morrison again." Ted shook his head slowly. "I already did." They crowded closer, running their fingers over the weld. Even the skeptics couldn't hide their awe. One of them finally said, "Then quit and start your own shop, Ted." The words hung in the air like smoke. Reckless, impossible, yet true. He laughed softly. A welder, a businessman, it sounded absurd. But that afternoon, as he walked home through the fog, the idea refused to leave. Maybe they were right. Maybe the only way forward was alone. June arrived with restless heat and endless work. Ted had officially quit Mare Island, and for the first time in his life, every hour belonged to him. He rented a tiny workshop near the edge of Vallejo, bare concrete floors, cracked windows, the hum of possibility in the air. There were no paychecks, no orders, no guarantees. Only debt, determination, and the hum of machines he could barely afford. He called it the Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Company. The name sounded far bigger than the space it occupied, but to Ted it meant freedom. He borrowed money, repaired old lathes, and hired one assistant, a young mechanic who believed in the impossible. Together they worked through nights, building the first production guns, each unit better than the last. By summer's end, a few small factories had ordered test models. 18 guns sold, and a handful of flux-capped studs. Not much, but it was proof that ideas could find their way into the world. Ted was no longer just a welder. He was a builder of belief. Autumn came quietly, but the world beyond his workshop was shifting fast. Whispers of war had turned into headlines. Each morning's newspaper carried darker news from across the Pacific. Ted worked faster, sensing that time itself was tightening around him. He didn't know when or how, but he felt it. His invention would be needed soon. The Navy had ignored him once, but history was preparing to knock on his door. Then came December. The radios spoke of smoke over Hawaii, ships burning in the harbor, the world erupting overnight. Pearl Harbor had changed everything. Factories roared awake, shipyards flooded with new orders, and panic filled the air. And somewhere amid that chaos, a single phone began to ring inside a small workshop in Vallejo. The same men who once dismissed him now needed him. The revolution that began in silence was about to echo across the nation. December 7th, 1941. Ted was tightening the bolts on a generator when the radio cracked with static and fear. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The words seemed to echo through the workshop, distant, unreal. He turned up the volume, listening as voices described burning ships and black smoke. Emma stood in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. The world had shifted in a single morning, and Ted knew his country would need every ship it could build. 2 days later, the phone rang. A voice on the other end sounded urgent, breathless. "This is Kaiser Shipyards. We need 50 welding guns, immediately." He almost dropped the receiver. Bethlehem Steel called next. Then Mare Island itself, the same place that had once rejected him. Ted smiled quietly as he hung up the phone. The war had begun, and so had his redemption. Within days, orders poured in faster than Ted could fill them. 50 guns for Kaiser, 40 for Bethlehem, 60 for the Navy itself. The same officers who once dismissed him now spoke with sudden respect. He didn't gloat. He simply worked, day and night, building as if time itself were his enemy. His small shop rattled with energy, sparks, hammering, and the hum of creation. A garage once meant for dreams had become a war factory. By January 1942, the first wave of shipments rolled out. Wooden crates stamped Nelson welding equipment lined the walls. Ted's invention was no longer an idea. It was a weapon of efficiency. Every new gun meant faster decks, faster submarines, faster victory. He had turned rejection into purpose, and purpose into power. Outside, the wind from the bay carried the sound of hammers from distant shipyards, and it sounded like hope. By spring, Ted's phone never stopped ringing. Every major shipyard on the West Coast wanted his machines. He expanded fast, renting a bigger plant in San Leandro, hiring dozens of men and women. The first month, they made 20 guns a day. By summer, 50. The factory ran 24 hours, 7 days a week. Each spark of light inside that plant meant another ship that could sail sooner. The sound of progress filled the air like thunder. Reports from the yards came back almost unbelievable. Deck installations that once took 6 days now took 1. 3 men could do what 12 once required. Scaffolding disappeared. The Navy called it miraculous. Ted called it common sense. He walked to the factory floor each night, touching the cooling metal, remembering the silence of the garage where it all began. And he smiled, not from pride, but from gratitude. Late in 1942, black cars arrived unannounced outside Ted's factory. 5 naval officers stepped inside, their uniforms bright against the soot-dark walls. Ted wiped his hands and waited. Captain Harrison spoke first, calm, formal, almost apologetic. "Mr. Nelson," he said, "your process has saved the Navy 5 million man-hours in less than a year." Ted said nothing, only nodded once. The men presented a folded document, a citation for excellence in war production. For the first time, the Navy that had rejected him came to say thank you. He listened as they explained the numbers, the speed, the success. But Ted was thinking about something else. The night in his garage when no one believed in him. The invention hadn't changed him. It had simply proven what he already knew, that real innovation doesn't need permission. As the officers left, one turned back and said quietly, "Sometimes the best way to serve is to ignore the rules." Ted smiled softly. He already had. By the end of that year, the numbers were staggering. Shipyards across the country were using Nelson's guns, from Liberty ships to submarines, from carriers to destroyers. 50 million man-hours would soon be saved. Each spark from his invention meant another ship launched, another crew brought home faster. Ted walked the factory floor, hearing not noise but rhythm, the heartbeat of a nation finally awake. He had done what they said could not be done. He looked up at the glowing sign outside the plant. Nelson Welding Equipment. The letters shimmered faintly in the cold night air. For a moment, he thought of every worker, every welder, every believer who refused to quit. That's who he built this for. If you believe in stories of people who turned rejection into power, subscribe and stay with us. Because in the next chapter, we'll see how this one invention reshaped shipbuilding itself and turned efficiency into America's silent weapon of war. By 1943, the Nelson plants in California and New Jersey ran without pause. Day and night, the rhythm of machinery replaced the sound of sleep. Men and women worked shoulder to shoulder, assembling the new welding guns that now powered America's shipyards. Sparks rained like fireflies under steel rafters, each one marking another hour saved, another ship built faster. Efficiency was no longer a dream. It was policy. The Navy called it a miracle. Ted simply called it work. Across the nation, shipyards began to change. Old scaffolds were dismantled, replaced by rolling cranes and teams of welders carrying Nelson guns. Wooden decks, once symbols of delay, now came together in a single day. The sound of bolts and wrenches faded, replaced by the sharp hiss of arc welding. Each second mattered. Each improvement was a victory not of war, but of wisdom. And through it all, Ted watched quietly, knowing that the miracle had only begun. The numbers were breathtaking. Where one submarine once took 6 months, now it took 3. Decks that required a dozen men for a week now needed only 3 men for a single day. 50 million man-hours, the measure of a nation's rebirth, saved through one welder's defiance. But behind those numbers were faces, the men who no longer spent their lives on scaffolds, the women who learned to weld, the families who saw their sons return sooner. Efficiency, Ted realized, was not just mathematics, it was mercy. Every weld was a story. Every spark that jumped between metal and flame was a heartbeat in steel. The shipyards no longer crawled. They moved like living things, breathing progress. Ted visited them sometimes. Richmond, Mare Island, Portsmouth. He'd stand quietly among the noise, watching new decks rise faster than he'd ever dreamed. No one recognized him now. But he didn't need recognition. The work itself was his monument. The effect was everywhere. Liberty ships slid into the water by the hundreds. Submarines launched 2, sometimes 3 at a time. The new method, stud welding, had spread like wildfire across every shipyard in the country. Each gun became a symbol of America's new rhythm, fast, strong, unstoppable. It wasn't just about production, it was about confidence. A nation once uncertain was now in motion. Ted's quiet revolution had become a roar. Reporters called it industrial magic, but there was nothing magical about it, just patience, precision, and courage. The war had demanded miracles, and America had answered with machines. For Ted, the miracle wasn't in the numbers. It was in the sight of workers smiling again, proud of what they built. The sound of welding had become the sound of hope. And somewhere above that thunder, the world was beginning to realize. The arsenal of democracy was powered by a single spark. The rhythm of progress had its own beauty. Men passed tools from hand to hand like a relay of purpose. Each welder, each builder, each riveter became part of a living chain that stretched from coast to coast. In every spark there was connection, from the garage where the first gun was born to the decks of the ships now crossing oceans. Ted often thought of that link, how a simple idea could travel through thousands of hands, shaping steel and destiny alike. The war had united them all, inventors, workers, dreamers, in one vast machine of creation. At night, when the factories grew quiet, the glow of cooling metal still shimmered across the walls. It looked almost alive, like a forge that refused to sleep. Somewhere, a radio played soft swing music, and for a moment, the war felt far away. Ted walked among the silent machines, listening to the hum that lingered after every shift. It was the sound of endurance, the echo of millions working toward the same hope. The miracle was not just efficiency, It was unity. The reports kept arriving. Graphs, charts, figures printed in black ink. 50 million man-hours saved. But Ted no longer read the numbers. He had begun to see them differently. To him, each hour saved was not a statistic. It was a story. A sailor who returned home sooner. A ship that reached its crew before winter seas. A family that slept easier because the war was ending faster. Efficiency had become something deeper, a measure of mercy. In Washington, the Navy's Bureau of Ships prepared to visit. They wanted to see the man behind the miracle. Ted didn't know what they would say, or if they would remember how they once ignored him. But he didn't care. The work spoke for itself now. And as he watched the sunrise spill across the factory floor, he felt only calm. The next chapter was waiting, and this time it would begin not with rejection, but with recognition. It was November of 1942 when the black cars stopped outside the San Leandro factory. Engines idled quietly in the fog. 5 officers stepped out, their polished shoes clicking against the concrete, their breath visible in the morning air. Workers paused, tools in hand, as the group walked through the open gates. Ted wiped his hands on a rag, heart steady, eyes calm. He had been expecting this moment, though he never imagined it would truly come. Inside the factory, the noise faded to a hush. Captain Harrison, representing the Navy's Bureau of Ships, spoke first. "Mr. Nelson," he said, "your invention has saved our shipyards millions of hours of work." Ted said nothing. The sound of machines in the distance seemed to speak for him. Then, as the captain unfolded a small folder, the men around him stood straighter. They weren't here to argue or inspect. They were here to honor. The Navy had come not with rejection, but with gratitude. Captain Harrison's voice carried through the quiet hall. "Mr. Nelson," he said, "on behalf of the Secretary of the Navy, we present you with a citation for exceptional contribution to the war effort." He held out a folded parchment, a symbol of acknowledgement from the same institution that had once turned him away. Ted hesitated for a moment before taking it. Not from pride, but from disbelief. He had never sought awards. He had only wanted to make things work better. The captain continued, softer now. "We read your original proposal from 1941. It was never properly reviewed. That was a mistake, and I apologize on behalf of the Navy." Ted nodded slowly. There was no anger left, only peace. For a moment, he looked around at the men and women who had built his dream beside him. This was their recognition too. Proof that quiet work could echo louder than orders. The ceremony was brief, but the silence afterward felt eternal. Ted held the document, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then growing until it filled the factory. He looked down, remembering the days of frustration, the letters unanswered, the nights alone with his notebook and torch. And now, here they were, the same Navy that had told him no, standing before him in gratitude. The irony was almost poetic. After the officers left, Ted stayed behind in the empty hall. The light shifted through the tall windows, painting long gold lines across the floor. He placed the citation on his workbench beside the first prototype of his welding gun, the one built in that tiny garage. For him, that old, scarred tool meant more than any metal ever could. Because it wasn't just a machine. It was proof that truth, once forged, can outlast denial. As the months passed, Ted's name began to circulate through shipyards and offices. Articles mentioned his invention. Reports praised his contribution. Yet he remained the same quiet man who preferred the sound of machines to applause. His workers often found him late at night walking the factory aisles, checking every crate, every shipment, every tool. He still wore his same tan work shirt and boots, still greeted everyone by name. Success hadn't lifted him above the floor. It had only rooted him deeper in it. He once said to a young mechanic, "If I ever stop working with my hands, you'll know I've gone soft." The war's demand was relentless, but so was his purpose. The Navy expanded its orders, new shipyards opened, and the hum of progress grew louder. Ted's invention was now part of something larger, a living rhythm that reached across oceans. At times, he wondered if the Navy truly understood what it meant to him. Not the medal, not the words, but the fact that they finally listened. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply being heard. When the second Navy delegation came, they brought more than awards. They brought admiration. They told Ted his process had now saved over 50 million man-hours, a number too vast to imagine. He nodded, listening. But part of him drifted away, remembering the notebook where it all began. That small idea, once dismissed, now carried an entire nation's shipbuilding effort on its back. The thought humbled him. As the officers left, one turned and asked, "How did you know it would work?" Ted smiled softly. "I didn't," he said. "I just knew it had to." He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, watching the sunlight fade over the factory roof. Every victory, he thought, begins as a question. And so he asks one more, to anyone who still believes that one voice can matter. Do you think a single idea can still change the world? Tell us in the comments. Because in the next chapter, we'll see what those 50 million hours truly meant. Not just in numbers, but in lives. By 1944, the numbers had grown beyond comprehension. 50 million man-hours saved. The Navy's reports were filled with charts and graphs, but none of them could capture the true meaning. Each hour saved was a moment stolen back from chaos, a ship built faster, a life spared from danger. Time itself had become a weapon, and Ted's invention had sharpened it. The miracle wasn't just in how much faster ships were made, but in how much closer victory now seemed. Across the shipyards, men and women worked with a rhythm that felt unstoppable. The long nights no longer felt endless. Each spark carried purpose, each weld whispered progress. Ted visited Richmond and Portsmouth, seeing ships rise like mountains of steel. He stood quietly by the docks as vessels slid into the water. Liberty ships, destroyers, submarines. Their decks gleamed beneath the dawn light, and Ted thought, this is what 50 million hours looks like. Liberty ships rolled down the ramps like clockwork, 3 per day, 75 per month. Each one carried the invisible imprint of Nelson's gun. Stud welds held every plank, every bracket, every mount in place. Without scaffolds, the shipyards built faster than anyone thought possible. Welders no longer bent in cramped compartments. They stood tall, working with precision and pride. Efficiency had given them dignity. Ted watched one of those ships, the Robert E. Peary, glide into the water after being built in just 4 days. The crowd cheered, sirens wailed, flags waved in the wind. He knew his invention was only a small part of that miracle, but still, he felt something move inside him. 50 million hours wasn't just time saved. It was momentum gained. Every spark, every weld, every second stolen from inefficiency became a heartbeat of freedom. And the echo of that heartbeat could now be heard across the world. Below the surface, the revolution continued. American submarines, faster to build, faster to repair, now patrolled the Pacific with relentless precision. Each vessel carried thousands of stud welds. Each weld a silent link between invention and survival. Ted's process had made it possible to construct entire boats in months instead of years, and those submarines struck deep into enemy waters, sinking ships, cutting supply lines, shortening the war itself. The sound of every torpedo launched was, in a strange way, the sound of a welder's spark years earlier. Ted read the naval dispatches in his office at night. He rarely smiled, but he understood. Behind every victory, there were workers who had made the impossible possible. He traced his fingers along a map of the Pacific pinned to the wall, dotted with submarine routes. Each line was a story written in steel. Each return trip was a promise kept. The welds held, and so did the world. 50 million hours. It sounded like an engineer's dream, but to Ted, it meant something deeper. He once told a reporter, "That number isn't time, it's lives." He was right. Every ship that reached the ocean a week earlier carried men who might otherwise have been lost. Every submarine completed ahead of schedule meant convoys protected, sailors rescued, missions completed. Efficiency wasn't cold calculation. It was compassion measured in steel and sparks, and the world had never seen anything like it. Across the country, the echo of that compassion spread through factories, docks, and homes. Families sent letters to shipyard workers thanking them for the ships that brought loved ones home. No one mentioned Nelson by name, but his fingerprints were everywhere, in every weld, every deck, every vessel that carried freedom. Some called him a genius, others called him lucky. But he knew the truth. He had simply refused to give up, and time itself had rewarded him. The war had turned the world into a clock, ticking, grinding, relentless. But Ted's invention had bent that clock, stealing back moments once lost to inefficiency. Now, with shipyards roaring and oceans full of steel giants, he began to see a new kind of future. He watched the young welders learning faster than ever, their hands steady, their confidence strong. Most of them were new. Many of them were women. They moved with quiet grace, sparks lighting their faces like constellations. They were the next chapter of his story, the living proof that progress had no boundaries. Ted often stayed by the factory door long after midnight, listening to the sound of the night shift, laughter, hammers, music from a distant radio. He thought about how far they had all come, from one man's sketch in a notebook to an army of builders shaping history. He smiled softly to himself. The torch was being passed, not to generals or officers, but to hands strong enough to hold it. The next miracle wasn't just mechanical, it was human. By 1943, the shipyards had changed. The men who once filled every deck and scaffold were now fighting across oceans. Their places were taken by women, thousands of them, mothers, sisters, daughters. They arrived wearing overalls, bandanas, and determination. The world called them Rosie the Riveter, but many became Wendy the Welder. With Nelson's new guns, they learned quickly, welding studs faster than anyone had imagined. In every spark, there was strength. In every weld, a message that courage had no uniform. Ted watched them with quiet admiration. He often walked through the production lines, offering guidance but rarely words. He saw hands once used to sew, cook, or write, now commanding the fire of creation. These women did not just fill roles, they redefined them. And as they worked, the rhythm of the war shifted. The sound of hammers and torches had changed. It carried a different kind of power now, a softer one, but just as unbreakable. The factory was alive with music. Radios played swing tunes between the thunder of machines. Women sang while they worked, laughter echoing through the halls. They were fast, focused, and fearless. Ted often paused at the doorway just to listen, not to the tools, but to the harmony of voices and sparks blending together. War had brought hardship, but it had also brought purpose, and these women carried that purpose with grace. The Navy sent inspectors often, surprised at how efficient the lines had become. They found no chaos, no disorder, only rhythm. Ted's welding guns had made it possible, but it was the women who made it real. They worked not for glory, but for the promise of peace. When asked how they managed such speed, one of them simply said, "We don't stop." And they didn't. The ships kept coming. So did the hope. Some said women didn't belong in shipyards, that welding and steel were men's work, but the results silenced every critic. Accidents dropped, quality rose, and production soared. Ted often said, "They weld better than we ever did." He meant it. The women's steady hands and patience brought precision to the process. Their work was not just fast, it was beautiful. Each stud gleamed like a signature left on history. At night, when the shifts changed, the factory glowed with the light of progress. The air shimmered with heat and pride. Women wiped sweat from their foreheads, faces streaked with soot and joy. They weren't waiting for praise. They were building victory. The same tools that had once seemed too heavy now moved easily in their hands. And, as the war dragged on, the world began to realize that the fire of creation burns brightest in those who refuse to be told they can't. Outside the factories, America was changing. Children collected scrap metal from the streets. Neighbors shared rides to save fuel. Families pasted ration stamps like badges of honor. But inside the shipyards, the heart of that home front beat loudest. Women worked double shifts, then returned home to cook, clean, and care for their children. They carried entire lives on their shoulders, and yet their resolve never cracked. When asked how they managed, one woman smiled and said, "Because someone has to." Ted understood that better than anyone. He had built the tool, but they had built the miracle. He often stayed late, watching the last workers leave, the air still glowing from fresh welds. He thought about how history would remember this moment, not just the ships, but the people who made them. The world saw rivets and hulls. He saw courage in motion. For every spark that rose, 1,000 hearts kept it burning. As victory began to shimmer on the horizon, the shipyards slowed. But the spirit within them did not fade. Many of the women would soon be asked to return home, to step aside for the men coming back from war. Some did. Others refused. They had found purpose in their hands, and they would not surrender it easily. Ted often said, "They built more than ships, they built the proof that anyone can." And he was right. Their legacy was not just steel, it was strength, endurance, and quiet defiance. He stood one last time at the factory window, watching the torches flicker across the floor. The light looked softer now, but no less powerful. He thought about every weld that had shaped the war, every spark that had carried a story. If you believe these stories deserve to be remembered, share this one with someone who has never heard it. Because in the next chapter, we'll see how Ted Nelson's invention, and the people who believed in it, built the foundations of the modern world. When the war ended in 1945, silence fell like dust over the shipyards. Cranes stood still, torches darkened, and the great hum of industry slowly faded. Contracts were canceled overnight, and workers began to drift away. For Ted Nelson, the change was both peaceful and painful. He had spent years building toward urgency, and now that urgency was gone. The Navy no longer called every week. The orders stopped coming, and the future suddenly looked uncertain. But Ted was not the kind of man who saw endings, only beginnings. He looked around his quiet factory and saw potential in every empty space. The war had proven what his invention could do. Now, he wondered, what could it build in peace? He walked through the silent hall, his boots echoing softly on the concrete. Every sound felt like memory. The sparks were gone, but the idea, the power to make things better, still burned quietly within him. Ted began adapting his invention for civilian life. He saw the same problems everywhere: bridges, buildings, factories, all wasting time the same way shipyards once had. Stud welding could fix that too. He redesigned his tools, making them smaller, lighter, safer. Construction companies noticed first, then steel manufacturers, then the automotive industry. By the late 1940s, Nelson's company had found a new rhythm, no longer driven by war, but by progress. The same sparks that once built submarines now built skyscrapers. He often said, "The best part of peace is that we get to keep building." His machines welded the bones of modern America. Bridges that carried commuters, towers that reached the sky, and factories that powered a new era. Innovation had left the battlefield and entered everyday life. The sound of welding, once the heartbeat of war, had become the quiet pulse of renewal. And though his name rarely appeared in headlines, his work held the world together, one stud at a time. Time moved forward, but the name Nelson never disappeared. His company grew quietly, merging with larger firms yet keeping its soul intact. Factories on both coasts still stamped his name onto crates shipped around the world. Ted visited one of them in the early 50s, gray-haired now, moving slower, but still full of the same curiosity. He smiled as he watched young welders use improved versions of his gun, sleeker and faster than the one he built in his garage. The sound it made was different, sharper, cleaner, but the feeling was the same. It was the sound of progress, He never boasted. When journalists asked how it felt to change the world, he would shrug and say, "I just made a better way to stick metal together." But those who knew him understood. It was never just about metal. It was about belief, that even the simplest idea, when forged with persistence, could outlast everything. And it had. The Nelson name was no longer just a signature on machines. It was a synonym for ingenuity. Years passed, and the world kept evolving. Faster, taller, brighter. Jet planes crossed oceans, television connected homes, and factories pulsed with electricity and steel. Hidden within it all was Ted Nelson's legacy, the quiet thread of connection, the unseen welds that held modern life together. Every bridge that carried travelers, every skyscraper that touched the clouds, every ship that braved the sea, bore traces of his invention. He had built not monuments, but foundations. His work lived where eyes never looked, inside the structures that shaped the future. Sometimes people would find his old patents in archives and marvel at the simplicity of his design. No complicated equations, no expensive materials, just intuition, courage, and a belief that small improvements could change everything. He was proof that innovation did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, and those whispers, multiplied across decades, had built the world itself. Ted's story had vanished from headlines, but not from history. In his final years, Ted lived quietly by the California coast. He walked the docks sometimes, touching the cool steel of ships anchored in the bay. Ships still built using the process he had imagined in his garage half a century earlier. He was old now, but the spark had never left him. He once told a young engineer, "You don't invent for fame. You invent because the world needs something better." The young man nodded, not yet realizing he was speaking to a legend. When Ted passed in 1994, the newspapers gave him only a few short paragraphs. No monuments were built, no parades were held. But somewhere, a welder pulled the trigger on a Nelson gun, and the same flash of light filled the air, connecting past and present in one silent instant. The world moved forward, unaware that it still carried his touch in every structure, every weld, every spark that shaped the modern age. And in that light, his story lived on, waiting to be rediscovered. Decades after the war, the old Mare Island shipyard became a museum. Visitors wandered past rusted cranes and dry docks where submarines once slept. Children pressed their faces to glass displays of blueprints, rivets, and old tools. But nowhere, not on the plaques, not in the guided tours, did anyone mention Ted Nelson. His story had faded, like the paint on the hulls he once welded. Yet his presence was everywhere. Every steel frame, every restored ship, every bolt that refused to rust whispered his name softly into the wind. A volunteer once found an old photo tucked inside a filing drawer. A man in work clothes holding a small welding gun. No caption, no recognition. But she placed it in a frame anyway, beneath a sign that read, "Innovation at Mare Island." Most visitors passed by without noticing, but sometimes one would pause, studying the photo as if the face itself carried something familiar. A quiet kind of greatness rarely needs a name to be remembered. Sometimes, legacy hides in the ordinary. In every skyscraper that pierces the clouds, in every bridge spanning a river, in every ship that still crosses the ocean. The welds that hold them together are quiet, unseen, untouched, but they endure. That was Ted's gift. He never built monuments for himself. He built the invisible joints that connect the world. Strength not meant to be admired, but trusted. If you stand in a shipyard today, you can still hear the same sounds, the hiss of flame, the hum of current, the rhythm of creation. Somewhere in that chorus, Ted Nelson's voice still lingers, not as a shout, but as a whisper, a reminder that progress often begins with a single thought no one believed in. The world moves forward, and the man who gave it speed remains, quietly, part of every spark. If you listen closely, every innovation has its echo. Ted's began with frustration, burned through failure, and ended with light. That light still flickers today in every act of persistence, in every person who dares to ask, what if there's a better way? His legacy is not just about welding steel. It's about welding courage to purpose, about turning rejection into revolution. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories of forgotten inventions, hidden heroes, and the quiet brilliance that shaped World War II, subscribe to WWW2 After Dark. There are more sparks waiting in the shadows, more untold moments of ingenuity that changed the world one humble idea at a time. Because sometimes the greatest victories aren't fought on battlefields, they're built in workshops. In the quiet of evening, the old shipyard stands still. Wind drifts through broken windows, carrying the faint scent of oil and salt. Somewhere, the metal creaks softly, like it remembers the weight of time. And if you wait long enough, as the sun sets behind the cranes, you can almost see it. A flicker of light in the dark, the echo of a welder's torch long extinguished. It's not memory, it's endurance. The same endurance that built ships, cities, and futures. Ted Nelson never sought fame, but through his persistence, he gave the world something far greater than recognition. He gave it time. The story of his spark reminds us that progress rarely announces itself. It begins quietly, with one person who refuses to stop trying. And somewhere tonight, another idea is being sketched in another notebook, waiting to change the world again.